She was just a line in the contract. Tucked between a broken-down tractor and a list of water rights, her name was listed under assets. Just a piece of property, like a shovel or a roll of barbed wire left leaning against a fence post. But Mason Coyle read past the ink. He saw what wasn't written down. He saw a girl. A girl standing barefoot on a rotted porch, with a hollowness in her eyes that spoke of things no child should know. A look that said she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to finally show up and say, no. Mason leaned forward in the saddle, the old leather creaking under his weight. He looked at the house. It squatted low against the gray autumn sky, like a tired old animal about to lay down and die. The wood was warped, the porch slumped. It was the kind of place you only bought if you had nowhere else to go, or nothing left to lose. Mason had both. The front door groaned open before he even had a foot out of the stirrup. A woman stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her jeans. She had the look of a realtor trying to pass as a ranch hand, wearing denim and dust like a costume. "Name's Dala," she said, her voice flat. She paused, as if deciding whether her own name even mattered in a place like this. "You're here for the deed." Mason didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on the small shadow standing behind her. The girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her hair was a pale, tangled mess, and a dark smudge stained one cheek, as if she'd tried to wipe away tears with a dirty hand. The dress she wore was 2 sizes too big, hanging off her small shoulders like a canvas sack. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just stared at Mason with those old, empty eyes, like she'd already sized him up and decided he wasn't worth the trouble of being scared of. "She come with the place?" Mason asked. His voice was quiet, rough as gravel. He knew the answer, of course. He'd read the contract. He just wanted to hear how Dala would say it. The woman shifted her weight, suddenly uncomfortable. Yeah, orphaned. Her folks passed in the spring. No other family that we know of. The county's been dragging its feet, so she's just been here. Like a loose nail in a floorboard, Mason said. It wasn't a question. Dala bristled, a flicker of defensiveness in her eyes. "It ain't right, but that's how it's laid out in the paperwork. She's part of the inventory." Mason's jaw tightened. Inventory. He looked back at the girl. "What's her name?" "Sadi." Sadi. He rolled the name around in his head. It felt too soft, too sweet for a child who looked like she'd been carved from silence and sorrow. Without another word, he reached for his satchel and handed it to Dala. "Cash, as agreed." She took it, her eyes lighting up as she opened the flap. Her lips moved silently as she thumbed through the worn bills. It was more than the worthless patch of dirt was worth. It was hurry up and leave money. "We're good," she finally said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'll get the papers from inside." Mason just nodded, his gaze never leaving the girl. As he took a step onto the porch, Sadie didn't move an inch. She just watched him, her stare as steady and unnerving as a hawk's. He took off his hat, the gesture slow and deliberate. He crouched down, bringing himself to her level, trying to seem smaller, less of a threat. "Folks call me Mason," he said, his voice softer now. "I figure you and me, we're in the same boat, so I'll make you a deal. I won't ask you to be here. If you want me to go, just say the word." She just stared. The seconds stretched out, thick and heavy. He could feel Dala watching from the doorway, impatient, ready to be gone. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the girl blinked, a slow, tired gesture, and then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was it. The deal was sealed. Not with ink and paper, but with a silent promise on a broken-down porch. He had a feeling this was the most important contract he'd ever signed. He had no idea how right he was. Dala left in a hurry, her boots kicking up dust that settled back down long before the sun dipped below the ridge. She didn't say goodbye, just stuffed the cash deep in her pockets and vanished. Another ghost leaving a haunted place. Mason didn't go inside right away. He sat on the top step of the sagging porch, lit a smoke, and just listened. The only sounds were the tired creak of the windmill and the groan of old wood settling under a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. He could feel her watching him, a tiny sliver of a face in the crack of the doorway. He didn't speak to her, didn't push. He just let the silence sit between them. He knew a thing or two about being cornered. The best thing you can do for a wild animal is give it space to decide you're not a threat. That night, he found her asleep on the floor in front of the cold stove. She was curled into a tight ball, no blanket, just her own small body trying to fight off the chill that seeped up through the floorboards. She looked like a stray pup, lost and alone. He lifted her gently. She weighed almost nothing. As he carried her to the only bed in the house, she stirred, just once. "Mama," she murmured, the word a ghost of a sound. Then she was still again. He laid her down, careful as if she were made of glass, and pulled the thin, dusty blanket over her. He slept on the floor beside the bed, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle he kept close. It wasn't a home yet. It was a guard post. The days that followed were long and hard. The ranch was more bone than flesh. The fences were down, the barn was half collapsed, and the only other living thing was a stray dog that limped around the edges of the property. It was feral, scarred, and suspicious of everything. Mason understood. He started leaving bacon scraps out for it, but he never called to it, never tried to get close. Some things, he knew, weren't meant to be caught. They had to decide to come to you on their own. Sadie was the same. She didn't speak much. When she did, her words were small and quiet, offered up like she was afraid they might be thrown back in her face. She followed him as he worked, a silent observer perched on a fence post, or dragging a stick through the dirt. He never asked her to help. She never offered. They moved in the same space, two lonely planets in a silent orbit. Not together. Not yet. The change came one morning when the first frost lay white on the grass. Mason was wrestling with a busted gate, cursing at a hinge so rusted it looked like it was bleeding. He didn't hear her approach. He just suddenly felt her there. She was standing beside him, holding out his hammer. She held it with both hands, like an offering. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He tried not to sound surprised. "You want to help?" She nodded. So he handed her a nail and showed her how to hold it straight while he swung the hammer. Her small fingers were surprisingly steady. That became their new rhythm. Quiet work, quiet meals, the silence punctuated by the clang of a hammer or a rare, whispered word. She slept in the bed now, every night. He took a cot he'd found in the barn and set it up by the stove. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Then came the letter. It wasn't delivered by any postman. It was just there one afternoon, tucked under the front door, a single piece of yellowed paper, folded once. He opened it slowly, his eyes narrowing as he read the crude, spidery handwriting. Sadie sat at the table, chewing on a piece of dried apple, not looking up. The letter was a claim. A man from a town called Coldwater. Said he was kin. Said he had a right to the girl. Said he was coming for her. Mason read it once, then twice. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He looked over at Sadie, so small, so quiet. He folded the letter, walked to the stove, and dropped it into the flames. He watched it curl, turn black, and disappear into ash. He didn't tell her. He wouldn't scare her. Not yet. But he knew. The quiet was over. The world was coming for them, and Mason was the only thing standing in its way. He didn't tell her about the letter, but he started preparing. The next day, he packed the saddlebags on his horse, heavier than usual. Food, water, ammunition. He showed Sadie how to hold the reins, how to speak to the horse in a low, calm voice, to soothe it when it got skittish. She listened, her eyes wide and serious. For the first time, he saw a flicker of something in them. Not happiness, not yet, but interest, engagement. And then she smiled. It was the faintest curve of her lips, barely there, gone as quickly as it came. But he saw it. and it hit him harder than a punch. It was a tiny crack of light in a dark room. Something worth defending. Something worth fighting for. He knew then he'd do anything to protect that flicker of light. He wouldn't have to wait long. Trouble came 3 nights later. It started with the sound of hoofbeats in the dark. Fast. Too fast for a friendly neighbor. Mason was at the door in an instant, his rifle in his hand. He'd been sleeping with it ever since he'd burned the letter. He saw Sadie standing behind the kitchen table, her eyes wide, but she wasn't alone. The limping dog was with her, pressed against her legs, a low growl rumbling in its chest. It had finally decided to come inside. It had finally chosen a side. A man on a tall horse rode into the yard and stopped just beyond the weak circle of light from the porch lamp. He was broad-shouldered, his face hidden by a thick, dusty beard. He didn't bother to dismount. "Came for the girl!" he yelled, his voice a raw bark. "Got papers, got proof. You're squatting on what ain't yours, and that includes her." Mason stepped off the porch, the rifle held loose but ready at his side. He moved slow, deliberate. "She's not a stray calf to be claimed. She's a child. Don't get righteous with me, old man. You ain't her blood." "And you are?" Mason challenged, his voice dangerously quiet. The man didn't answer. He just pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest and waved it in the air. "You want to see the signature? It's all legal. Now send her out." Mason raised the rifle, the barrel glinting in the moonlight. "I want to see you gone." The man spat in the dirt, his eyes glittering with rage. He wheeled his horse around and thundered off into the darkness. But Mason knew this wasn't over. The man hadn't ridden far. He was just regrouping. He'd be back, and he wouldn't be alone next time. Mason turned and looked at Sadie. She hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. She was just watching him, her small face a mask of stone. The fear was there, deep in her eyes, but she was holding it down. "You trust me?" he asked her softly. She nodded once. No hesitation. He let out a long, slow breath. "Then pack a bag. We're leaving." They were gone before the first hint of dawn. Mason left no note, swept their tracks from the yard, and left the door to the farmhouse swinging in the cold breeze. He lifted Sadie onto his horse, settling her in front of him, her small body tucked tight against his chest. She clutched a small canvas bag, and the dog jogged alongside them, its limp somehow not slowing it down. The sky cracked open with cold, blue and silver bleeding into the black as they rode. He didn't speak. She didn't ask where they were going. Some children ask questions to soothe their fear. Sadie just held on tighter. He knew the man from the yard wasn't what he seemed. His boots had been too clean under the dust. His horse wore a city saddle, and the letter hadn't felt right. This wasn't about a long-lost uncle showing up to do his duty. This was about something else, something valuable. And Mason was starting to suspect the most valuable thing on that worthless piece of land wasn't the timber or the water rights. It was the girl. They rode hard, pushing away from the ranch and into the tangled wilderness that bordered the property. By the time the sun was fully up, Mason had left the main trail, cutting onto an old hunting path, nearly swallowed by overgrown brush. Every step was a struggle, branches snapping like bone under the horse's hooves. The dog moved like a ghost beside them, a silent, limping shadow. Mason didn't know who these men were, not really. But he knew their type. He knew the greed that could drive a man to claim a child like she was a piece of gold discovered in a creek bed. Maybe her dead father owed a debt. Maybe there was something hidden on that land, something in a title or a will that made her valuable. Or maybe it was something worse. He didn't know. He only knew that men who came in the night shouting about papers were never driven by kindness. By noon, they reached what he was looking for, an abandoned line shack, tucked away beneath a sheer rock cliff. The roof sagged and one wall had collapsed, but it was hidden, and it was dry. For now, that was all that mattered. He lifted Sadie down from the horse. She stood by the cold fire ring, clutching her small bag, while he checked the inside of the shack. It was a wreck. a mouse nest in one corner, a single broken stool, and an old stove with a crooked pipe. He set to work, clearing it out, making it livable. While he worked, Sadie knelt down and started feeding the dog small pieces of jerky from her bag. He watched her for a moment. The way she moved, so careful, so quiet. It struck him then that she'd never been allowed to be a child. Her hands were too steady, her eyes too old. She was a survivor. She'd been surviving long before he ever showed up. They stayed in that hidden shack for 3 nights. Each night was colder than the last. Mason kept a small, nearly smokeless fire going, and he taught her how to bank the coals to keep them alive till morning. He caught a few small fish in a nearby creek and cooked them over the fire on the blade of his knife. Sadie watched his every move. She learned quickly, mimicking him, as if the world made a little more sense when someone finally showed her the rules. She never asked him why they had run. She never asked about the man on the horse. But on the 3rd night, as the fire crackled and the dog snored softly at her feet, she said something that stopped him cold. "That man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He didn't smell like home." Her eyes were fixed on the flames, her small fingers wrapped around a tin cup of tea he'd made her. He kept his own voice low. "What does home smell like?" She was quiet for a long time, her brow furrowed in concentration. He thought she might not answer. Then she looked at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. "Like rope," she said. "Like smoke. Like you." It almost knocked the air out of his lungs. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing at all. He didn't sleep much that night. He just sat by the fire, listening to her breathe, feeling the weight of her trust settle on him. It was heavier than any law, any claim, any piece of paper. Sometime in the deep dark, she stirred, crawling from her blanket to nestle against his side. The dog crept in close behind her, resting its head on his boot. Mason didn't move. He just sat there, a silent guardian for his tiny, broken family, and waited for the sun to rise. On the 4th day, he knew they had to move on. They couldn't stay hidden forever. He needed help. He needed a place to think. He had one last friend in the world, or what passed for one, a man named Elias Kells. Elias ran a smithy in a forgotten town called Red Lark. He was half blind, mean as a badger, and knew how to keep his mouth shut. More importantly, he owed Mason a favor, a big one. They rode south towards Red Lark. It was a risk, but staying put was a bigger one. He had a feeling their pursuers weren't the kind to give up easily, and he had a feeling they were just the beginning. Red Lark was barely a town, just a handful of leaning shacks, a sagging saloon, and the sharp, rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel. That sound was Elias. The bell on the smithy door didn't jingle. It clanged like a warning when Mason pushed it open. The heat from the forge hit him like a physical blow. Elias Kels looked up from the anvil, his one good eye narrowing. A low growl was already forming in his throat. "Well, hell," he muttered, his voice like rocks grinding together. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet, Elias," Mason said. Sadie stepped in from behind him, a small shadow in the fiery glow of the forge. The dog crept in after her, staying close to her heels. Elias blinked, his one good eye focusing on the girl. "Who's the stray?" "Her name's Sadie." "That a daughter you forgot to tell me about?" "No." Elias waited. Mason offered no more explanation. The old blacksmith grunted, then jerked his head toward the back of the smithy. "Got a room over the stables. It ain't pretty, but it's warm. And the door locks." They took it. That night, the 3 of them shared a meal of beans and biscuits in the small room off the side of the smithy. Sadie ate slowly, carefully, like she was afraid someone would snatch the plate away. After a moment, Elias slid his own portion of salt pork onto her plate without a word. Later, after Sadie had curled up on a pile of old saddle blankets with the dog, Elias finally spoke. "You're running," he said. It wasn't a question. "A man came to the ranch, said he had a claim on her. And you believed him?" "No," Mason said. He was a front, just a voice and a piece of paper. There's someone else behind him, someone with money. Elias leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. Why the girl? What's so special about her? I think she's tied to the land somehow. Her name might be on a title I never saw. Or maybe there's something buried under that busted-up porch. I don't know, but they want her, Elias. And I don't trust men who use the word guardian with a smile on their face. Elias took a long drink of his bitter coffee. You planning to fight them? I plan to run, Mason said, until they get tired of chasing. Elias looked at him with his one good eye, a strange light in it. You ain't the running type, Mason. I am now. 2 days passed in quiet tension. Mason earned their keep by working the forge, the familiar work a comfort to his frayed nerves. To his surprise, Elias started showing Sadie how to do simple tasks, straightening bent nails, twisting small hooks. She took to it with a silent intensity, her face smudged with soot and something that looked almost like joy. Then, he came. Not the bearded man from the ranch. This one was different. He was lean, clean-shaven, and wore expensive leather. A polished badge was pinned to his coat. He spoke with an educated Eastern accent that sounded alien in the dusty streets of Red Lark. He walked right into the smithy, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Mason. I'm here for the girl, he said to Elias, his voice calm and authoritative. Elias spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt near the man's polished boots. Wrong town, friend. I have court orders. You've got a mouth, too, Elias growled. I ain't impressed by either one. Mason stepped out from the shadows of the forge. He'd sent Sadie into the back room the moment he saw the man approach. The dog stood near the doorway, ears flat, a low rumble in its chest. My name is Marshal Trent Caro, the man said, his eyes locking onto Mason. Appointed by the county court to ensure the welfare of the child, Sadie. We've had reports that she's in the company of a dangerous man. Reports from who? Mason asked, his voice flat. Caro smiled, but it was a cold, empty thing. That's confidential information. Show me the paper, Mason said. Caro reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Mason took it. The paper felt new, the ink smelled fresh. He scanned the words. It looked official enough, full of legal phrases and formal seals. But something was wrong. It cited laws that hadn't been on the books for 10 years. The signatures belonged to judges who were long dead. It was a masterful forgery, but it was a forgery nonetheless. Mason looked up, a slow, cold smile spreading across his own face. This isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Caro's professional mask didn't slip. Are you accusing a federal officer of fraud? You want to risk obstruction charges, Mr. Coyle? He knew his name. They had done their homework. I've risked worse than that for a lot less, Mason said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He let the forged document fall to the dirt floor. Caro's eyes hardened. He knew he'd lost. For now. He gave a curt nod, turned on his heel, and walked out of the smithy. Elias watched him go. They'll be back, Mason, and they'll bring more than a piece of paper next time. I know, Mason said. He was already thinking, planning their next move. That night, Elias said something that chilled Mason to the bone. That man, Caro, he had the same look in his eye as the men who came for my sister, 20 years ago. Mason looked at him, surprised. Elias never talked about his past. They had papers, too, Elias continued, his voice low and full of gravel. Said she was connected to a land dispute. Said she was a witness. They took her for her own protection. We never saw her again. A terrible thought began to form in Mason's mind. This wasn't just about money or land. This was older, darker, and Sadie was right in the middle of it. Before dawn, they were gone again. Elias gave them his sturdiest pack mule and all the jerky he had. Head for Devil's Elbow, he'd said. It's a nasty slot canyon up in the high country. No one's fool enough to ride in there this time of year. As they were leaving, Elias knelt down in front of Sadie. He pressed a small, perfectly formed horseshoe into her hand. For luck, he said. his rough voice surprisingly gentle. Sadie looked at the horseshoe, then up at the old blacksmith, and she smiled, a real one this time. A smile that lit up her whole face. It hurt Mason's heart more than he thought possible. They rode hard, climbing higher into the desolate mountains. The air grew thin and sharp, the wind a constant knife against their skin. Sadie didn't complain. She just leaned into Mason's chest and held on tight. They reached Devil's Elbow as dusk was turning the sky a bruised purple. It was a narrow gash in the rock, a canyon so deep the sun rarely touched its floor. Mason had found it years ago, when he'd been running from something else entirely. He knew its secrets. He knew about the cave. Hidden behind a curtain of rock and ancient twisted roots, there was a small cave with a spring that never froze. They slipped into the shadows of the canyon, leaving the world behind, and disappeared. Inside, the cave was dark and cold, but it was safe. For now. As Mason unpacked, Sadie came over to him. She held out the small horseshoe Elias had given her. "You keep it," she whispered. "I think you need it more." He looked at her, at the impossible strength in her young eyes. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just took the horseshoe and closed his hand around it. The cold metal, a small, solid anchor in a world that was coming apart at the seams. He knew they couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, they would have to turn and face whatever was hunting them. But as the wind howled through the canyon outside, he had the terrible feeling they weren't being hunted by men anymore. They were being hunted by something much, much older. The wind screamed for 2 solid days. It clawed at the stone walls of the canyon, a relentless, shrieking sound that scraped at Mason's nerves. He kept the fire small, tucked deep in a pit he'd dug, the smoke barely visible against the dark rock. He'd survived winters in worse places than this, but never with a child depending on him. The weight of it was immense. Sadie slept curled up with the dog, a small island of warmth in the oppressive cold. He watched her across the flickering firelight, the little horseshoe he'd placed by her sleeping roll glinting in the dark. He tried not to imagine a future for them. It was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with men like Trent Caro on their trail, and not with a past of his own that had made him a ghost in 5 counties. On the 3rd morning, the wind died. The silence that followed was sudden and absolute, more unnerving than the noise had been. Snow hung in the air, thick and motionless. Mason stepped out of the cave. The world was white and still. He moved quietly down the ravine, checking for any sign they'd been followed. He found nothing. No hoof prints, no broken branches. But that didn't mean they were safe. Caro was the patient type, the kind of man who lets you run until you're exhausted, until you make a mistake. Back in the cave, Sadie was sitting by the fire, turning the horseshoe over and over in her hands. "You ever wish things were different?" she asked, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. Mason fed a couple of twigs into the fire. "Different how?" "Like before." She paused. "I don't remember my ma real well, just that she used to sing. Off-key. I miss the singing." He didn't answer right away. He thought of his own family, a lifetime ago. "Sometimes," he said, his voice rough, "the good things just happen to." She didn't press him. She just leaned her head on her knees and watched the fire breathe. That night he dreamed. Not of Caro, but of things much older. He dreamed of horses lost in blizzards, of a name being shouted from a courthouse step, of his own boots walking away from a life he could never get back. In the dream, Sadie was standing on the porch of the old farmhouse, holding the crooked horseshoe, and her eyes were telling him he had a choice to make. He woke up with a start, the dream dissolving into the cold air of the cave. They left the next day, heading west, climbing higher into the pine-choked ridges. Sadie rode with an easy confidence now, no longer a frightened passenger, but a partner in their flight. She trusted him completely, and he wasn't sure if that made things easier or harder. As dusk fell, They found a hunting cabin half buried in a snowdrift. The roof sagged, but the door was solid. Mason broke the lock with a rock and they stepped inside. It was musty and cold, but it was shelter. An old iron stove, a broken table, a few cracked dishes, nothing worth stealing, which made it the perfect place to hide. They stayed for 3 days. On the second day, Mason knew he had to risk going for supplies. He left Sadie with the dog and his rifle, making her promise not to open the door for anyone. She nodded, her face as solemn as a judge. The nearest town was Red Hollow, a place that whispered instead of shouted. Mason kept his hat pulled low and his mouth shut at the general store. He bought flour, beans, jerky, and a small tin of peppermint drops for Sadie. He was almost back to the cabin when he saw them. Tracks. Fresh boot prints in the snow. 2 sets. Not his. Not Sadie's. His blood ran cold. He dropped the supply sack and drew his pistol, moving silently up the trail. The wind carried the scent of pine, wood smoke, and something else. Something metallic. He saw them in the clearing just below the cabin. 2 men. One was crouched by the cold fire pit, the other paced back and forth, a rifle held at the ready. "Think the kid's still in there?" the pacing one asked. "Could be," the other grunted. "Caro said he'd pay double if we bring her back alive." "And if we don't?" "Still pays. Just less." Rage, cold and pure, surged through Mason. He stepped out from behind the trees. "Try it," he said, his voice a low growl. "And I'll see you both paid in blood." They spun around, caught completely by surprise. His gun was already up, steady as a rock. The one by the fire went for his pistol. Mason fired once, a clean shot through the man's thigh. He went down screaming. The other one dove for cover, trying to bring his rifle around. Mason fired again, the bullet grazing the man's shoulder, sending him sprawling. He stood over them, his face a mask of stone, the smoke from his pistol curling in the frigid air. "You go back and you tell Caro something for me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You tell him I'm done running. He wants her. He can come and get her himself." One of the men, clutching his bleeding leg, spat on the ground. "She's worth more than you think, old man." Mason's eyes were chips of ice. "She's worth more than you could ever measure." He turned and walked back to the cabin without a backward glance. That night, he didn't sleep. He stood watch by the door, rifle in hand, knowing this was far from over. Caro wouldn't stop. There was something else at play here, something bigger than a simple land grab. Someone was pulling the strings, and Sadie was the puppet they were all fighting over. The next morning, he rode back to Red Hollow. This time, he went straight to the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk was half asleep. "I need to know if a Marshal Trent Caro came through here," Mason said. The sheriff blinked. "Name's not familiar." "He'd be asking about a girl, maybe flashing some fancy federal papers." "No federal men been through these parts in months," the sheriff said, his eyes shifting away. Mason leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the desk. "You lie to me," he said softly, "and it will cost you a hell of a lot more than your badge." The sheriff paled. "Look," he stammered, I heard someone was sniffing around about the old Wilkes place. Tall fella, fancy coat. Didn't say he was law, but he acted like it." "The Wilkes place, that was the farm." When Mason got back to the cabin, Sadie met him at the door. She was holding the tin of peppermints. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah. Did you have to hurt anyone?" He hesitated for only a second. Only a little. She nodded as if that made sense, but the next day, she said something that made the hair on his arms stand up. "I saw a man outside last night," she said, her voice small. Mason froze. "What kind of man?" She tilted her head. "He wasn't real. He was see-through, like smoke, but he had a hat, and he waved at me." He knelt down to her level, his heart pounding. "What did you do?" "I waved back," she said simply. He didn't feel mean. He just felt cold. Mason didn't tell her what he was thinking, that the land itself was haunted, that the past was curling in around them, reaching for the girl who had its name in her deed. That night, he stared into the fire. And for just a second, in the dancing flames, he thought he saw it too. A figure outside the window. Not threatening, just watching, waiting. Sadie was asleep, the horseshoe clutched in her hand. Mason whispered into the silence of the cabin, not sure who he was talking to. The ghost, the land, the darkness itself. Whatever you are, you stay back. She's mine now. And out in the woods, the shadows seemed to pull back just a little. For now. The snow came back that night, falling thick and heavy, sealing the cabin in a silent, white tomb. Mason was already awake. Sadie's story about the see-through man had burrowed under his skin. He didn't believe in ghosts, not really. But he believed in old places that held on to pain. And he trusted the dog, who hadn't barked at the visitor, but had stood with its hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in its chest. The dog knew something was wrong. When he shoveled the doorway clear, he found it. A single boot print, just at the edge of the woods. It wasn't his. It wasn't one of the bounty hunters. It was narrow, with a slight drag in the heel. It was half filled with new snow, but the shape was undeniable. It had been made by the same person whose track he'd found when they first arrived. Someone had been there before. Someone was watching them. Or worse, someone was living there, a ghost in the trees. He erased the track with his boot and went back inside, his mind racing. This land was sick, not just haunted, but unsettled, like its very bones were trying to tell a story no one wanted to hear. That night the wind returned, not screaming, but whispering. Low, mournful sounds that slid through the cracks in the walls like voices. Mason sat by the fire, rifle across his knees. The dog paced relentlessly. Sadie slept. And outside, something moved. By dawn, he'd made a decision. They had to go back. "Where are we going?" Sadie asked as he saddled the horse. "Into town first, then back to the farm. I thought it wasn't safe." "It ain't," he said, his voice grim. "But it's worse to stay here and wait for it to find us. Whatever's chasing us started at that farm, and I think that's the only place we can end it." She looked at him, her old soul eyes searching his. "You think it's mad that I got away?" "I think," he said slowly, "that something was meant to stay buried, and we dug it up." They rode into Red Hollow, a town that seemed to be holding its breath. Mason got them a room at the boarding house, a small, clean space that smelled of lye soap. "I like this room," Sadie said, sitting on the bed. "It feels less lonely." Mason knew what she meant. The cabin hadn't been empty. He left her there with the dog and went to find the sheriff. He found him in the saloon, nursing a bottle. "Caro's not working alone," Mason said, getting straight to the point. "And they're not just after the girl. They're looking for something connected to the Wilkes place." The sheriff stiffened. "You best not be stirring up that name, Coyle. The Wilkes land is trouble. Always has been." "What kind of trouble?" "The old kind," the sheriff muttered, refusing to meet his eyes. "Old man Wilkes claimed he found silver on that property, drove him mad, fought with all his neighbors. Then one night, the house burned. Wilkes, his wife, they were gone, and their girl, she vanished. That was 20 years ago. No one's lived there since. Every family that tried. Something bad happened. Death. Disappearance. Until it just sat there rotting. Until your girl." A cold dread washed over Mason. He was right. Sadie was the key. She hadn't just inherited a piece of land. She'd inherited a curse. When he got back to the boarding house, Sadie was pale. "Someone knocked," she said. "Who was it?" "He didn't say a name. He just left this under the door." She held out a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was elegant, precise, completely different from the crude scrawl on the first letter. Mason's fingers felt numb as he unfolded it. "You should have left her where you found her. She was part of the sale. Now, you both belong to the land." There was no signature. It didn't need one. He burned it in the room's small stove. That night, neither of them slept. The old building creaked and groaned around them. The dog whined, a low, constant sound of distress. They were riding back to the farm by morning. As they reached the edge of the property, the place looked different. The snow was gone, melted away in patches, as if the ground itself was feverish. And there was smoke curling from the chimney of the crooked farmhouse. A figure was standing on the porch, arms folded, waiting for them. It wasn't Caro. It wasn't one of his men. It was a woman. Sadie froze in the saddle, her breath catching. "That's her," she whispered, her voice filled with a strange mix of fear and recognition. "Who?" Mason asked. "The one who fed me." Mason dismounted, his rifle held ready. He walked slowly toward the porch. "You the one leaving notes?" he called out. The woman didn't move. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face pale and still. "You fed this girl?" Mason asked, stepping closer. "You kept her in that house?" The woman's lips barely moved, but her voice echoed in his head, cold and clear as a winter sky. "She belongs to the land." "Not anymore," Mason snarled. "She's with me. You cannot take what was promised. She's a child. She is a key." Mason raised his rifle. "You're not having her." The woman smiled, a slow, terrible curving of her lips. Then she turned and walked back into the house, melting into the shadows. Mason hesitated for only a second, then stepped onto the porch. The front door swung open on its own, beckoning him in. The air that drifted out was cold, smelling of damp earth and something sweet like dying flowers. He stepped back, his heart pounding. What was this place? What was this woman? Behind him, Sadie's voice was a tiny, frightened whisper. "I don't want to go back in there, Mason." "You won't have to," he growled. He took a step back, looked at the house, and made a decision. He wasn't going to fight this thing on its own terms. He was going to burn it to the ground. He didn't know it yet, but that was the worst mistake he could possibly make. They made camp a safe distance from the farmhouse, in a thicket of pines that offered some cover. Sadie was quiet, her small face etched with a fear so deep it had gone past tears. The dog stayed pressed against her, a warm, living shield. Mason didn't try to sleep. He just sat with his rifle, watching the dark, silent shape of the house. Nothing happened. No lights appeared. No one came out. But he could feel it. A pressure in the air, a thrumming energy, like the house was a sleeping beast, dreaming of them. The woman on the porch, she wasn't a ghost, not exactly. She was something older, a memory the land had given a body, a guardian, a jailer, and her words echoed in his mind. She is a key. The next morning, driven by a gnawing dread, Mason went back to the farm alone. He circled around the back of the house, to a part of the property where the trees grew thick and the ground never seemed to thaw. And there, half hidden by overgrown thorns, he found it. A second building, a tiny, windowless shack, its wood warped and black with age. The door hung from a single rusted hinge. He pushed it open. The smell hit him first, mold, rot, and the faint coppery tang of old blood. His eyes adjusted to the dim light. There was a cot in the corner, and on the wall, a set of shackles. The chains were thin, delicate. They were small enough to hold a child. He saw it then, scratched into the rough wood of the wall. S.W. Sadie Wilkes, over and over again. And next to the initials, tally marks, dozens of them. He counted 86 days. 86 days she had spent in this dark, cold box, alone. Chained. He stumbled outside and was violently sick in the bushes. This was where she had been. Not in the house with the woman who fed her, but here, in this cage. The woman was her keeper, bringing her food and water, keeping the key safe until it was needed. He walked back to the camp, his face a grim mask. He knelt beside Sadie. "I found where they kept you," he said, his voice thick. She looked at him, her eyes unnervingly calm. "The shack. You remember it? Only the dark," she whispered, "and the sound the chain made when I moved." He swallowed the lump of rage and grief in his throat. Did you ever see who brought you food? She nodded. The woman, the one from the porch. Was Caro ever there? Her eyes darkened. He stood in the doorway sometimes. He never talked. He just watched. Mason's hand clenched into a fist. He knew men like Caro, too cowardly to do the dirty work themselves, but all too eager to watch and to profit from the suffering of others. This had to end. Now. He rode back to Red Hollow, a storm brewing in his heart. He didn't go to the sheriff. He went to the old, crumbling church at the edge of town. The preacher was ancient, his eyes clouded with cataracts. When Mason mentioned the Wilkes farm, the old man didn't flinch. You've been there, haven't you? With the girl. I'm trying to save her. The preacher poured them both tea with a trembling hand. Have you ever heard the term bloodland, son? No. It's what happens when a piece of ground remembers. When so much pain soaks into the dirt, it festers. It's not just about death. It's about betrayal, a promise broken, a child's cry that goes unanswered. The land itself gets a wound, and sometimes that wound grows something. Something like her, Mason whispered. The preacher nodded. She's not just a girl, son. She's an echo. She's the key to the original wound, to whatever evil still bleeds under that ground. Then how do I stop it? You can't, the preacher said, his voice filled with a terrible certainty. You can't heal the land. You can only run from it. Mason stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't accept that. You don't have to. But the land does. He rode back to their camp with a desperate plan forming in his mind. He was done running. He was done hiding. He was going to meet this thing head on. Caro was waiting for them at the broken gate of the farm. He had 2 armed men with him this time. His face was pale, his eyes wild with a fanatic's gleam. You've made it worse, he screamed as Mason rode up. You don't understand what you're messing with. Mason dismounted, his rifle in his hand. She wasn't yours to keep in a cage, Caro. She wasn't a prisoner. She was an offering. She belongs to the house. She's the last piece of the puzzle. Without her, the gate can't be closed. It will just keep bleeding out, poisoning everything. Let it bleed, Mason said. Caro raised his hand, and his men leveled their rifles. Mason fired first. One of the men dropped. The other, seeing the look in Mason's eyes, turned and fled into the woods. Caro didn't even flinch. Kill me, he whispered, a strange, ecstatic look on his face. It won't change anything. It's awake now, and it's hungry. Mason lowered his rifle. He walked past Caro and through the gate. Sadie followed on foot, her small hand gripping his. The dog stayed back, whining, refusing to cross the property line. Smart animal. They walked into the farmhouse. The air was thick and heavy, charged with a malevolent energy. The walls seemed to shift and breathe around them. The woman was waiting in the parlor. She wasn't a ghost, not flesh, but something in between, woven from shadow and memory. This is your fault, Mason said to her. I was the keeper, her voice echoed, not the wound. She's not yours. She was made here, fed here, bled here. She is of this place. Mason raised his rifle. Then I'll burn this place to ash. The woman smiled that terrible, slow smile. You cannot burn a memory. Sadie, her voice trembling but firm, stepped forward. You hurt me, she said to the woman. You left me in the cold. You were meant to open the gate. I won't. Then you will stay, the woman whispered. Forever. No, Mason said. He pulled a lantern from his pack, one he'd filled with oil. He smashed it on the floorboards. The oil spread in a dark, hungry pool. He struck a match. This ends now. He tossed the match. The fire didn't just catch. It exploded. It roared to life with an unnatural speed, consuming the dry, rotten wood in an instant. The walls themselves seemed to scream. The woman vanished, dissolving into the flames. Mason grabbed Sadie and they ran, bursting out of the house just as the roof began to collapse in a shower of embers. Outside, Caro was on his knees, screaming, You fool! You didn't end it, you just opened the cage. Mason turned and looked at the inferno. The house groaned, and then fell in on itself, sending a column of black smoke and fire high into the twilight sky. Then, silence. A real, true silence settled over the land. The pressure in the air was gone. Sadie looked at the burning ruins of her prison, her face illuminated by the flames. She looked back once, then turned away and never looked back again. They rode away from the fire, away from the cursed land, thinking it was over. But the fire hadn't destroyed the evil. It had just set it free. For 3 months they lived in peace, or what passed for it. They found a small, quiet town in the next valley over, a place with a schoolhouse and a stable that needed a man who knew how to work. Mason took the job. Sadie went to school. She started to change. She grew taller. The haunted look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a child's curiosity. She even laughed sometimes, a sound that was still strange and new to both of them. The dog, her constant companion, seemed to sense the change too. His limp was less pronounced, and he no longer barked at shadows. But Mason knew. He knew that silence could be a lie. He kept a shotgun under his cot and slept with one ear open. He knew that you don't walk away from a thing like the Wilkes farm. It leaves a mark on you. One afternoon, Sadie came home from school with a piece of folded paper. "The teacher didn't give me this," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "It was just on my desk." Mason took it. There was no name, no stamp, just 3 words scratched in what looked like red chalk. "It still breathes." He read the words, and the fragile piece they had built shattered like glass. He burned the note without letting her see it. But that night, the weight was back in the air. That night, the dog whimpered in its sleep. He sent a telegraph to a name he hadn't used in 5 years. A man named Pritchard, a prospector who knew the dark corners of the territory better than anyone. The reply came 2 days later. "Something's wrong up near the old mining basin north of Red Hollow. Air's gone still, ground's gone cold." Mason knew. The fire hadn't been an ending. It had been a birth. He told Sadie he had to go away for a few days. She just looked at him with those old eyes. "Will you be safe?" she asked. He lied and told her yes. He met Pritchard at the edge of the basin. The place was dead. The trees were black and leafless, though it was the middle of spring. No birds sang. "Something dug its way out," Pritchard said, his face pale. He pointed to the ruins of an old church. "Right from under the altar, left a hole clean through to God knows where." Mason looked down into the crater. The earth was split open like a fresh wound. He knelt and touched the edge. It was warm. "I need dynamite," Mason said. "How much?" "All of it." They spent 2 days planting the charges, working in the eerie silence. On the 3rd morning, they lit the fuse and ran. The explosion was immense. It shook the mountains. The entire basin collapsed in on itself, burying the unholy hole under 1,000 tons of rock and dirt. Mason rode away, hoping, praying, that he had finally buried the monster. But when he got back, Sadie had stopped speaking. The schoolteacher said she hadn't said a word in 3 days. She just sat at her desk, staring out the window, drawing strange patterns on her slate, circles within circles, spirals that seemed to twist into infinity. When Mason asked her about them, she finally looked at him. Her eyes were dull, her face blank. "They come from the dark," she whispered. That night, the dog growled for hours, a deep, guttural sound of pure terror. Mason took his shotgun and sat on the porch. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The darkness was absolute, pressing in from all sides like a physical weight. Just after 3 in the morning, he heard it. A sound from the roof, a soft, wet, dripping sound. He climbed up, shotgun ready. There was nothing there, but the shingles were slick and wet, as if something had been standing there dripping water or blood or something worse. He sent another wire to Pritchard. Did it work? The reply came at dusk. 1 sentence. "We thought we buried it. We were wrong." Mason began boarding up the windows. Sadie watched him, her expression unreadable. You're scared, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. I'm ready, he lied. 2 nights later, he woke with a start. The house was cold. Sadie's bed was empty. He found her standing barefoot in the yard, staring at the woods. The dog sat beside her, silent, trembling. Sadie? He called softly. She didn't turn. It wants me, she said, her voice flat and distant. It's not getting you. It says it's already inside me. Who says? Mason demanded, his blood running cold. The man with no face, she whispered. He says I'm still the key, and the door is open now. He looked at his girl, this child he had sworn to protect, and saw the darkness swirling behind her eyes. The fire hadn't destroyed it. The dynamite hadn't buried it. They had only made it angrier. And now it had found a new home. Not in the land, not in the house, but inside the girl. That night he made a choice. He saddled his horse before dawn. He took no food, no water, just rope, a bag of salt, his shotgun, and a small carved wooden box he hadn't opened in 20 years. He was going back to the source. He was going to offer it a trade, his life for hers. He rode toward the charred ruins of the Wilkes farm. He walked to the center of the blackened foundation, to the place where the wound was deepest. The air was cold, dead. I know you're here, he said to the silence. The ground beneath his feet trembled. You want the key? He shouted into the emptiness. Then come and take it from me. Leave the girl alone. The earth split open. Not a chasm, but a crack. A voice rose from it. A sound made of 1,000 screams, of all the pain and betrayal the land had ever held. It had no body, no face. It was pure rage, pure memory. You bled her, you marked her, you made her mine. No, Mason said, his voice shaking but firm. I made her free. He opened the small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single faded piece of cloth, stained with old brown blood. He had carried it for 2 decades, a remnant from the first tragedy, a piece of the dress worn by another girl, lost to this same evil. A girl whose family had been his enemy, but whose death had haunted him his entire life. Annie Wilkes. He threw the cloth into the crack in the earth. The ground didn't just scream, it roared. The darkness writhed, and the very air seemed to tear apart. Mason knelt and whispered the name he hadn't dared to speak in 20 years. Annie. A light erupted from the ground. Not fire, but a soft, white glow that turned the shadows to ash. The screaming stopped, and then silence. A final, peaceful silence. Mason stood, coughing, covered in ash, but the air was clean. He walked away, not looking back. He woke up days later, in a bed in the sheriff's office, with Sadie sitting beside him. I heard you, she said softly. In my dream, I heard you say her name. Mason nodded, his throat too tight to speak. It's raining, she said, looking out the window. He turned his head. The first real rain in months was washing the world clean. She took his hand. Is it over? I think so, he whispered. She smiled, a small, tired, real smile. It's quiet now, she said. Everything's quiet. And for the first time, Mason believed it might be true, but the land remembers, and evil has a very, very long memory. The rain washed the world clean, but it couldn't wash away the scars. For a year they lived a quiet life. Sadie grew. She learned to read and write. She made friends. The dog, now old and gray around the muzzle, never left her side. Mason worked, fixing fences, mending things that were broken, trying to mend himself. He never told her the full story of Annie Wilkes, or how his own family had been part of the feud that had poisoned the land in the first place. Some stories are burdens, not lessons. Then the letters started. They arrived without stamps or postmarks, simply appearing on their doorstep. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, and chillingly familiar. The first one was addressed to Sadie June Halberd, a middle name and last name Mason had never known. Her mother's name. Inside was a single pressed flower petal and a message. You were never meant for sale. You were born to open the gate. The mistress was weak. The master is patient. Mason burned it. But a week later, another one came. It walks now, and another. It remembers your name. He bought a second shotgun. He renewed the salt lines at the windows and doors. The quiet was over. The hunt had begun again. Then the man came. He appeared at their fence line at dusk, a tall, impossibly thin man in a fine brown coat that had no place in their dusty town. He didn't speak. He just stood there and stared at the house. Stared at Sadie. Mason met him at the gate, shotgun in hand. "You're trespassing." The man smiled, a polite, razor-thin expression. "I'm merely looking for what was lost. A key has been misplaced." "Nothing lost here," Mason growled. "You think fire and ash and a whispered name could erase a covenant?" The thin man said, his voice smooth as silk. "She was bound to the land before she was born. She was never yours to unbind. Get off my property before I bury you on it." The man's smile faded. His eyes were black, empty pits. "We are already under your feet," he whispered. Then he turned and walked away, vanishing into the twilight as if he were made of it. That night the house groaned. The ground itself seemed to tremble. Sadie sat bolt upright in her bed, her eyes wide with terror. "Now," she whispered. "It's coming now." They ran. The sheriff was waiting for them at the edge of town, a wagon already hitched. He didn't ask questions. He'd seen the thin man, too. He just drove them south through the night, toward the border. They stopped at a ruined church, its roof open to the sky. This was it, the final stand. Mason drew a circle of salt around the crumbling stone altar. He had Sadie stand in the middle of it. He took out the old wooden box, but it wasn't the cloth he reached for this time. It was the box itself. He smashed it, revealing names carved into the wood. The names of all the victims, all the souls the land had claimed. "You have to do it, Sadie," he said, his voice urgent. "You have to speak the words, the ones your mother taught you." "I don't remember," she cried. "Yes, you do. They're inside you." The wind stopped. The air grew thick, cold, and a darkness gathered in the doorway of the church. It wasn't the thin man. It was something with no shape, a form made of pure malice. "You don't get her!" Mason yelled, standing between Sadie and the door, shotgun raised. "You took Annie! You took her mother! You've taken enough!" The darkness laughed, a sound that cracked the stone walls. Then the dog walked in. But it wasn't their dog anymore. It stood taller, its muscles corded and powerful. Its eyes glowed with a faint, protective golden light. It walked to Sadie, circled the salt line once, and then lay down at her feet. A guardian. A sentinel against the dark. The air inside the circle shimmered. The altar lit up, not with fire, but with memory. Sadie gasped. She saw them. Faces she'd never known. The woman from the porch, the bearded man, even Caro, victims and servants all trapped. Behind them all stood Annie Wilkes, her face a mask of sorrow. And they all reached for her, not to harm her, but to support her. The darkness in the doorway screamed in rage, and the words came to Sadie, a language older than towns, older than fences, words of power, words of unmaking. She spoke them, her voice clear and strong, and then she spoke a final name, not her mother's, not Annie's, the name of the man who had started it all, the one who made the first blood pact with the land, the name of Mason's own ancestor. "I unbind you," she declared. "I forgive you. I release you all." The wind exploded through the church, a cleansing, powerful force. The darkness was torn apart, shredded into nothingness. When it was over, Sadie was on her knees, weeping. The dog, just a dog again, licked her face. The spirits were gone. The air was clean. Mason rushed to her, pulling her into his arms. She was smiling through her tears. "It's gone, Mason," she whispered. "It's really gone. It's all quiet now." He held her tight, the rising sun warming their faces through the broken church roof. They went back home. No more letters came. No more shadows haunted their steps. The past was finally, truly buried. Sadie grew up. Mason grew old. And when people in town asked who the girl was to him, he never said she was his daughter or his ward. or a girl he'd rescued. He'd just look at her, the woman she'd become, strong and kind and free, and he'd say one word: mine. And she would smile and say he was hers, not by blood, but by every battle they had fought and won together. They were family, the only kind that truly matters. If you enjoyed this story, and the endless fight between the light and the dark, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You never know what's waiting just under your feet.